Sundays here at Little River Church. None of the famous Bible passages that I or others have preached from is more famous than this one this morning that we read from John's Gospel in the 3rd chapter. And it's famous because really of the first verse, the verse with which it begins, namely John 3:16, which I would reckon must be among the top two most well-known Bible verses that there are. The other one being, of course, that verse in the Sermon on the Mount that's come to be called the Golden Rule from Matthew in the 7th chapter, Jesus saying, "Do unto others as you would have others do unto you." This verse, John 3:16, is right up there with that one, I reckon, as being the two most famous verses there are. That one verse, John 3:16, was singled out by the great Protestant reformer in the 16th century in Germany, Martin Luther. Luther said of this one verse, John 3:16, that it was the heart of the gospel in miniature, which was really to say that if you did not know anything else about God or Jesus, that if you knew only what was contained in the one verse, John 3:16, that would likely be enough for you to know God and what God was up to in the world through Jesus Christ, his Son. John 3:16 certainly does tell us much of great importance about God and Jesus. I would suggest to you that the most important thing, however, it tells us is that it adds a third L word to the vocabulary that John's Gospel teaches us about God and Jesus. Do you remember from last week how we read from John chapter 1, the first 14 verses, the so-called prologue of John's Gospel? And in those first 14 verses, John introduced to us those two L words, life and light. And these were the two L words that he began to build his gospel, construct his story of Jesus around. How he described to us is Jesus as being the true life of the world. In him, in verse 4, he says, "In him Jesus was life, and the life was the light of all people," John tells us. Jesus is presented in John's Gospel as the source of true life, life that is fuller than mere biological existence, life that is finally bigger and stronger than physical death, and also the true light of the world, light that comes into the world and pushes back against and finally overwhelms and overcomes the world's, our human moral and spiritual darkness, the light that finally overcomes the darkness. John 3:16 adds a third L word to those two, and that word is love. And in effect, John 3:16 then tells us the why behind why God would send into the world in the birth of his Son Jesus, the Word made flesh, why God would send this source of true life and true light into the world. And the reason, John says, is love. God so loves the world that God could do no other. The God of the Bible is simply unable to stand idly by and watch the creation perish. Watch the creation fall hopelessly, in other words, into darkness and death. And that word perish, for God so loved the world, he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him might not perish. John chooses that word carefully because that's not the typical word for dying in the New Testament. Perishing is worse than dying, because perishing means that you have died as though you never actually lived at all. You have died as though you never actually lived at all. And the God of the Bible, because of love, John's Gospel tells us in 3:16, simply cannot stand idly by and watch that happen. And so he sends Jesus, the source of true life and true light. And this truth that God so loves the world, this has been true all across the Scriptures from cover to cover. And it's actually been something of a problem for God, you could say, a sort of a problem. Going all the way back to the book of Deuteronomy, very interestingly, in the 7th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, we have Moses talking to the covenant people, the original covenant people, Israel. and telling them just before they enter the promised land, Moses, who's led them out of slavery in Egypt, led them through the wilderness wandering all those many years, now to the point of they're being about to enter the promised land. And so he's telling them in the book of Deuteronomy lots of things. But here in chapter 7, he is reminding them of the basis on which they have been chosen by God as God's covenant people. And listen to what he says here in verse 6 of chapter 7. The Lord your God, he says, has chosen you out of all the peoples on earth to be his people, his treasured possession. Verse 7, but it was not because you were more numerous than any other people that the Lord set his heart on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all the peoples. Verse 8, it was because the Lord loved you. It was because the Lord loved you that he chose you. But isn't that the way it always is? How many spouses say to one another over the years of their marriage, honey, I love you. Honey, I love you too. And then the other one says, well, why do you love me? And then the conversation kind of slows down. Because you don't know what to say. Because that's how love is. It's kind of sub-rational. Think of that being the basis for God's relationship with his chosen people, Israel. He just loved them. And that's why he chose them. Well, this love of God was constant across many generations of ancient Israel's existence. Even when the covenant people failed repeatedly and tragically to fulfill the mission for which God called them into being, this mission of being in the world and serving by the way they lived together, serving as a shining example for all the other peoples of the world to follow. Even when the people had failed repeatedly, tragically, and finally catastrophically failed in this mission, and God was to the point of saying, I give up on you people. I absolutely just give up on you. The scriptures reveal that God actually could not do that. He could not do that. And so we read these amazing words in the 11th chapter of one of the books in the Old Testament, one of the prophets, Hosea. We read these amazing words in Hosea chapter 11 that shows us the very heart of God. Here's God speaking kind of to himself. When Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt, I called my son. The more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to false gods and offering incense to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim, and that's sort of like a pet name, a term of endearment for Israel. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and fed them. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am God and no mortal, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. Amazing words that let us listen into the very heart of God. God wants to be done with these people, but he cannot. Throughout the Old Testament, throughout the scriptures, God certainly allows human beings to experience the sad and painful consequences of their wrong choices, but God never entirely gives up on either his covenant people or on humankind in general. Remember the story of Noah. Noah before the call of Abraham, before there was a covenant people, Noah representative of all humankind. God looked down at Genesis chapter 6 and all humankind and said, it's hopeless.